The scars of slavery run deep, etched not just on the backs of individuals, but on the very fabric of society. For centuries, millions were subjected to the barbarity of chattel slavery, their lives, families, and humanity stolen. Can the wounds inflicted be healed? Can the scales of justice be balanced after generations of suffering? The answer, complex and multifaceted, lies in the pursuit of reparations. You are welcome to quite a serious one today. A deeply troubling reality. One which we must wholeheartedly visit if we must heal wounds and erase scars. If we must bury the old and erect anew, reparations for the old undying ravages caused by slavery.
The recommendations for reparations must include compensation, restitution, which accounts for stolen land or stolen wealth, stolen opportunities, rehabilitation, free education, free healthcare. Is examples. I'm not saying those are going to be the final recommendations.
The notion of reparations for the transatlantic slave trade, that system of human exploitation that stained humanity's past, is a hotbed of debate. Critics scoff at the possibility, dismissing it as impractical, divisive, and even unfair. Supporters, however, argue with unyielding passion that the wounds inflicted are far from healed, and that true justice demands acknowledgement through concrete action. To simply say reparations are way overdue is simplistic, yet undeniably true. But navigating this issue demands delving into the tangled mess of history, understanding the multifaceted ramifications of slavery, and acknowledging the challenges and possibilities discussions on this affair presents. Imagine a cosmic debt, an unfathomable ledger filled with unpayable entries, centuries of stolen lives, severed families, stolen labor, and shattered identities. Even uttering the word reparations feels inadequate in the face of such profound harm. Generations have borne the weight of this legacy, woven into the very fabric of society through entrenched inequalities in wealth, education, healthcare, and access to opportunity. It's not merely a matter of individual suffering, it's a systemic distortion, a collective scar that refuses to fade. The wounds of slavery, though centuries old, still bleed in the fabric of our society. The scars of forced labor, stolen families, and broken spirits echo in the disparities that plague black communities even today. While monuments to abolition stand tall, the true bill for the sins of the past remains unpaid, a moral debt that festers with each passing generation. To deny reparations for these damages is not merely an oversight, it is a deliberate act of perpetuating the legacy of injustice. Imagine a merchant who, after years of exploiting a supplier, declares them free but refuses to settle the outstanding accounts. The supplier, despite their newfound freedom, remains crippled by the unpaid debts and the legacy of exploitation. This, in essence, is the predicament of Black Americans or blacks in every country slavery ever took place. Emancipation granted liberty, but it did not erase the economic plunder, the psychological trauma, and the systematic disenfranchisement that were the hallmarks of slavery. To argue against reparations based on practicality is to ignore this enduring reality. Can money truly erase the ghosts of the auction block, the sting of Jim Crow laws, the echo of police brutality? No, it cannot. But it can acknowledge the debt, offer tangible steps towards healing, and dismantle the structures that perpetuate the legacy of slavery. Investing in communities ravaged by systemic disadvantage, funding educational initiatives, establishing healthcare programs rooted in racial equity. These are not handouts, but overdue investments in rectifying a historical injustice. The wealth generated on the backs of enslaved people fueled the rise of nations. Yet black communities were denied access to this very wealth through discriminatory policies like Jim Crow laws and redlining. This economic disenfranchisement continues to reverberate today, manifesting in the wealth gap, limited access to quality education and healthcare, and the higher rates of poverty that plague black communities. Opponents of reparations often cite the impracticality of quantifying and addressing the immeasurable harms of the past. They argue that such efforts would be divisive, fueling resentment and fostering a culture of victimhood. However, this argument ignores the reality that a nation built on the foundation of injustice cannot achieve true equality without acknowledging and addressing its past. Reparations, then, are not about mere monetary compensation, though that may be a part of the solution. They are about acknowledging the collective responsibility for past wrongs, about investing in the future of communities that have been historically marginalized and denied opportunities. Reparations are measures that seek to rectify a heinous injustice with an acknowledgement and an apology. In this context, they refer to an attempt to remedy the unpaid labor of millions of Africans who arrived in the English North American colonies as human chattel. Their work was vital to the accumulation of American capital, but neither they nor their descendants shared in the benefits. The goal of any reparations plan today would be to compensate the 40 million descendants of the enslaved people, and, in theory, to narrow the disparities caused by slavery. The forms that reparations can take are varied and open to discussion. Educational initiatives aimed at closing the achievement gap, healthcare programs addressing generations of health disparities, and investments in black businesses and communities are just a few examples. The goal is not to create a zero-sum game, but to build a more just and equitable society for all. On a memorable Friday, July the 17th, the rapper and activist shared a 2-page open letter to the UK insurance giant, demanding that the firm pay reparations to the descendants of African slaves for its role in the transatlantic slave trade. Our people have been financially impaired and economically disabled due to the systemic oppression and institutional racism it leaves behind. T.I. captioned an Instagram post featuring the letter, "Time to take what we know our ancestors deserved and died for." This was the result of Lloyd's acknowledgement on the month of June of its ties to the slave trade and the pledge to make amends, which included recruiting more black employees and providing financial support to charities that promote diversity and inclusion. But T.I. says that just isn't enough. "Your commitment to reparations is an honorable one, but commitment without tangible actions is merely lip service," he wrote in the letter. "We demand a specific call to action that includes, but is not limited to, direct reparations be made to the families who were ripped from their native lands and sold as property, while your company profited from the whole shameful endeavor." Interestingly, T.I. goes on to suggest 4 effective avenues for reparations. 10% ownership of Lloyd's be given to the descendants of African slaves, accurate annual tracking of those reparations, a $1 million cash loan with 1% interest to every African American adult once in their lifetime for the next 200 years, and at least one African American member on its board. The rapper closed his letter by urging Lloyd's to have a comprehensive reparation plan in place by fall of 2020. "We have waited long enough, and our community deserves real action and much more than empty apologies or platitudes," he writes. It's only getting interesting and somewhat hopeful, seeing the fever of conscience on the rise these recent times. The Bank of England apologized on Friday for its historic links to slavery and promised to ensure no images of former bank officials who owned slaves or profited from slavery are on display. The UK Central Bank had 27 former members, including 11 former bank governors and 16 directors, who owned slaves or profited directly from the slave trade, according to a database maintained by University College London. The bank's announcement had come a day after 2 venerable brand-name British companies, insurance exchange Lloyd's of London and the Brewer Green King, announced that they would make reparation payments for the historic role the firms played in slavery. Furthermore, on the 8th of November 2023, just a few weeks ago, Lloyd's of London announced that it will pay a whopping £52 million in reparations on account of the significant role it played in the transatlantic slave trade. The 55-year-old insurance firm, located in the heart of London, unveiled plans to support black and other minority ethnic people in work and education as a way of making amends. The company underwrote enslaved people as part of a ship's cargo and previously described the period as shameful. An estimated 3.2 million enslaved African people were transported by Britain's shipping industry. Research conducted by Johns Hopkins University revealed the capital played a significant role in enabling the slave trade between the 17th and 19th centuries. But Lloyd's has resisted calls to pay direct reparations to the descendants of slaves, after arguing lack of documentation made it impossible to identify wronged individuals. It also found that many individuals working in the insurance marketplace used their own expertise and influence to develop and defend the slavery system. Documents kept in archives even showed several senior figures at Lloyd's were enslavers themselves and absentee owners of slave plantations. Lloyd's chairman Bruce Carnegie Brown said, "I don't think we can undo the wrongs of the past, but we can take action to address the impacts which are still seen today. And racial inequality is one of those impacts in UK society and around the world. Lloyd's culture chief Mark Lomas added, "We're aware that no one can properly atone for the past, but what we have done is set out a framework that we believe will make sustainable change over a long-term period. The insurance marketplace will spend around £12 million supporting the careers of black and ethnically diverse people in insurance. An additional £40 million is being invested to boost growth within communities affected by historical enslavement. However, while it feels fair enough and a great deal relieving to hear of these developments in London, its status on the affair of reparations is not actually similar with that of the United States. Discussions about atonement for the enslavement of black Americans have a long history in the United States. Most famously, General William T. Sherman drafted Special Field Order 15 in 1865. The order stipulated that Confederate land seized in Georgia and South Carolina would be split among formerly enslaved black people in those states, no more than 40 acres per family. That didn't work out in the end. Black Americans commonly refer to this measure as 40 acres and mule, and it has become a long-standing symbol for both the promise of and pessimism about repayment for slavery, or reparations. Do you like to know more about the story behind 40 acres and mule? Let's dive in. As the Civil War was winding down 150 years ago, Union leaders gathered a group of black ministers in Savannah, Ga. The goal was to help the thousands of newly freed slaves. From that meeting came General William T. Sherman's Special Field Order 15. It set aside land along the southeast coast so that each family shall have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground. That plan later became known by a signature phrase, 40 acres and a mule. After wrapping up his famous march, Sherman spent weeks in Savannah, staying in an ornate Gothic revival mansion called the Green Meldrum House. That's where he and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton held their meeting with local black leaders. The house is now owned by a local church. Susan Arden Jolie, the site's preservationist and tour guide, leads visitors up a winding staircase. Sherman's memoirs say that he took them upstairs to his quarters, so that's where we will go, she says. According to Arden Jolie, the meeting took place in a high-ceilinged room on a corner of the second floor. Sherman and Stanton asked the group's leader, the Reverend Garrison Frazier, a series of questions. She reads from Sherman's memoirs, where he quotes minutes from the meeting. Fourth question. State in what manner you would rather live, whether scattered among the whites or in colonies by yourselves, she reads, continuing with Frazier's answer. I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over. Charles Elmore, a professor emeritus of humanities at Savannah State University, says Sherman and Stanton listened to Frazier and the others. The other men chose this eloquent, 67-year-old imposing black man, who was well over 6 feet tall, to speak on their behalf, Elmore says. And he said essentially we want to be free from domination of white men, we want to be educated, and we want to own land. 4 days later, Sherman signed Field Order 15, setting aside 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land for freed slaves. Sherman appointed Brigadier General Rufus Saxton to divide up the land, giving each family up to 40 acres. And it wasn't in the order, Elmore says, but some also received leftover army mules. But it became known as of January 16, 1865 as 40 acres and a mule, Elmore said. Stan Deaton of the Georgia Historical Society points out that after Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson reversed Sherman's order, giving the land back to its former Confederate owners. Once the passion of war was over, the idea of that kind of social experiment lost favor with a lot of people very quickly, he says. Vornette Good Walker, a writer who leads tours focused on Savannah's black past, calls it one of the biggest gotchas in American history. Here, take this land. But we can't really give it to you because it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the Confederates when they come back home. How confusing is that? The reversal left many African Americans with few options but to become sharecroppers, often working for former slaveholders. But Elmore says the meeting in Savannah 150 years ago accomplished one important thing. It set in motion the dialogue between the white power structure and black men in Savannah Gay, he says. What do you all want? And they got some of it, however temporary and fleetingly. They got it. That is significant. However, Efforts toward reparations for slavery and racial discrimination have moved forward in some places in recent years. In 2021, Evanston, Illinois, became the first U.S. city to create a reparations plan for its black residents, and California that year set up the nation's first state-level reparations task force. In 2022, Harvard University created a $100 million Legacy of Slavery Fund for black students who are descendants of enslaved people, and to allow scholars and students to examine the university's connections to slavery. Given this enduring history, the survey asked Black Americans to share their views on the impact of slavery on their position in the United States, whether the descendants of enslaved black people should be repaid for the labor of their ancestors, the forms of repayment that would be most helpful, the institutions or individuals who bear responsibility for repayment, and the likelihood that repayment would occur in their lifetime. Americans view the prospect of reparations mostly negatively, a 2021 Pew Research Center survey found. 3 in 10 U.S. adults say descendants of people enslaved in the U.S. should be repaid in some way, such as given land or money. About 7 in 10, that is, 68%, say these descendants should not be repaid. Views of reparations for slavery vary widely by race and ethnicity, especially between black and white Americans. Around 3/4 of black adults, that is, 77%, say the descendants of people enslaved in the U.S. should be repaid in some way, while 18% of white Americans say the same. There are also notable differences by partisan affiliation. Among Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents, views are split. 48% say descendants of enslaved people should be repaid in some way, while 49% say they shouldn't be repaid. By comparison, only 8% of Republicans and GOP leaners say these descendants should be repaid in some way, and 91% say they should not. When it comes to age, younger adults are more likely than older ones to say the descendants of enslaved people should be repaid. 45% of adults under 30 take this view, compared with 18% of adults 65 and older. When Americans are asked about the legacy of slavery's effect on black people today, 50% of the overall public says this affects the position of black people in American society at least a fair amount, with 28% saying it affects them a great deal. 4 in 10 U.S. adults say the legacy of slavery has not much or not at all affected the position of black Americans in the country today. In the Center's 2021 survey, the 30% of Americans who favored reparations were also asked about the institutions and individuals who bear responsibility for repayment. They were presented with 4 options: the U.S. federal government, businesses and banks that profited from slavery, colleges and universities that benefited from slavery, and descendants of families who engaged in the slave trade. 3/4 of reparations supporters say the federal government has all or most of the responsibility to repay descendants of enslaved people. A smaller share, though still a majority, that is 65%, say businesses and banks that profited from slavery have all or most of the responsibility. Fewer, on the scale of 53%, say the same about colleges and universities that benefited from slavery, and descendants of families, 44%, who engaged in the slave trade. Reparations supporters were also asked how helpful the following forms of repayment would be: educational scholarships, financial assistance for starting or improving a business, financial assistance for buying or remodeling a home, and cash payments. These adults, 82% of them, are most likely to say educational scholarships would be very or extremely helpful, followed by financial assistance with businesses, 75%, financial assistance with home buying or remodeling, 73%, and cash payments, 57%. Missouri Democratic Representative Cori Bush introduced new legislation calling for $14 trillion in reparations for black Americans in an effort to see the federal government atone for the practice of chattel slavery and hundreds of years of racist policies that followed. The United States has a moral and legal obligation to provide reparations for the enslavement of Africans and its lasting harm on the lives of millions of black people, Bush said in a Wednesday news conference attended by Reps. Barbara Lee D. Khalif and Jamal Bowman DNY, as well as other stakeholders. America must provide reparations if we desire a prosperous future for all, Bush said. Her resolution is the latest in a long line of congressional efforts by Democrats to compensate black Americans for centuries of racial inequity. Similar language about reparations has been introduced in every legislative session since 1989. We know that we continue to live under slavery's vestiges. We know how slavery has perpetuated Jim Crow. We know how slavery's impacts live on today, Bush said, citing the racial wealth gap, voter suppression, infant mortality rates, and other negative health outcomes for black people. It's unjust, and it wouldn't happen in a just and fair and equitable society, she said. Those are not the natural consequences of human society. They are directly caused by our federal government's role in the enslavement and exploitation of Africans and black people throughout our history. While the conversation around reparations has picked up traction in recent years, with about a dozen cities and the state of California considering reparation programs, the concept remains broadly unpopular with Americans. About 3/4 or more of white adults oppose reparations, and so do a majority of Latinos and Asian Americans. Black Americans overwhelmingly support the proposal, and young people in general are more likely to support cash payments to the descendants of enslaved people than their older counterparts. But more than 90% of Republicans say they oppose it, while Democrats are split nearly 50-50 on whether descendants should receive compensation. Bills introduced in the House and Senate would create a commission to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and the racial and economic discrimination against black Americans that followed. Such a commission, the bills say, would consider a national apology and proposals for reparations. Some of the leading voices on the matter, both for and against, have a personal connection to the issue. They have one or more ancestors who were slaveholders. Among them are 3 prominent Democrats who have co-sponsored reparations bills: Senators Elizabeth Warren and Chris Van Hollen and Representative Lloyd Doggett. Opponents include Republican Senators Tommy Tuberville and John N. Kennedy, and former Representative Louis Gohmert. The issue is divisive. A Reuters survey found that slightly more than half of respondents identifying as Democrats, 58%, support reparations. Just 18% of Republicans do. The divide is even greater between black and white America. The poll found that 74% of black Americans favor reparations compared to just 26% of white Americans. A House resolution introduced in May in favor of the idea cites estimates from respected economists that reparations to eliminate the racial wealth gap would cost at least $14 trillion. Proponents say such payments are meant to help compensate for more than slavery itself. They cite systemic racism and other forms of discrimination that followed emancipation. Opponents say reparations would further divide the country. They question who would get the money. Would all black Americans or only descendants of people who could show that their ancestors were enslaved? They also say it's wrong to have taxpayers finance reparations, given that no one alive today is responsible for slavery. In examining the genealogies of members of the 117th Congress, Reuters found that at least 100 lawmakers have direct ancestors who enslaved black people in the years before 1865, the end of the U.S. Civil War. Some have espoused strong positions on reparations. As a Republican member of the House Judiciary Committee, Gohmert was one of the most vocal critics of long-standing House Resolution 40, which calls for Congress to form a commission to study reparations. On April 2021, Gohmert went on the attack by proposing an amendment calling for the Democratic Party to pay for reparations. In the slavery era, the Democratic Party supported slavery. The Republican Party, led by Abraham Lincoln, called for slavery's restriction and eventually abolished it. At the time, Gohmert suggested his own family had no connection to slavery, citing an ancestor who immigrated after the Civil War. "I have seen the documents where my great-grandfather signed when he came from Europe in 1870, he said. Reuters found that Gohmert has another direct ancestor on his mother's side, who enslaved 11 black people in Bowie County, Texas in 1860. Those enslaved by Gohmert's ancestor, Robert Lindsay, ranged in age from a 3-month-old boy to a 70-year-old man. Lindsay was a lawyer who, shortly before his death in 1860, chaired a meeting that organized a vigilance committee in the community of Boston in Bowie County. It issued a statement resolving that any white man caught tampering with our slaves to bring about an insurrection would be caught and killed by the committee. Gohmert, who joined Congress in 2005 but did not seek re-election last year, told Reuters he wasn't aware of having a slaveholding ancestor. "That surprises me," he said. He declined to comment further. At a Republican rally in Nevada last October, Tuberville, an Alabama senator, took aim at Democrats for being soft on crime. In his critique, he veered into the issue of reparations and implied that those who commit crime in America are black. "They want crime because they want to take over what you got," Tuberville said of Democrats. "They want to control what you have. They want reparations because they think the people that do the crime are owed that. Bullshit, they are not owed that." In a statement to local media about his controversial remarks, Tuberville said in part, "The issue is crime, not race, but the liberal media is intent on helping Democrats remain in power." The statement did not address his claims about reparations. An ancestor of Tuberville, Valentine Brazil, in 1840, enslaved at least 5 black people in Saline County, Arkansas, including 2 boys under the age of 10. Brazil moved to another county in the state, Ouachita, and by the next census count in 1850 enslaved 3 people between the ages of 17 and 22 years old. Tuberville did not respond to 5 requests for comment. In 2019, a reporter asked Kennedy, a Republican senator from Louisiana, about his thoughts on reparations. "Slavery was reprehensible," Kennedy said. He added, "I believe in personal responsibility, and I just don't think someone today is responsible for what someone else did 150 years ago." Kennedy is a direct descendant of a man named Nathan Calhoun, who in 1860 enslaved 65 people. They lived in 14 slave houses on his farm in Abbeville, South Carolina. Nathan Calhoun's son, Dabney P. Calhoun, enslaved 22 people that same year in Louisiana. Kennedy did not respond to 5 requests for comment. Warren, a Massachusetts Democrat, is a co-sponsor of S-40, the Senate reparations bill. In an 1848 will, a Warren ancestor named John Crawford bequeathed the 14 men, women and children enslaved in Dorchester County, Maryland. For 12 of them, ranging in age from a 4-month-old infant girl to a 28-year-old woman, Crawford specified that each female would be freed at age 31 and each male at 36. For 2 other men named in the document, Crawford wrote that they would be slaves for life. The legacy of slavery still casts a long shadow over every facet of American life, including Congress, Warren said in a statement to Reuters. "While we cannot change the past, I am fighting in the Senate to address systemic injustices through word, deed, law, and policy." In closing, the pursuit of reparations is not about settling old scores, but about building a better future. It is about recognizing the human cost of slavery and actively working to undo its lasting damage. It is a long, complex journey, but one that we must embark on if we are to truly honor the memory of those who suffered and create a more just and equitable world for all. The wounds of slavery may be way overdue for healing, but it is never too late to begin the process. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Hope you enjoyed it. Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. We are eager to know what your thoughts are. Don't forget also to support our works by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening narrative, and kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support is immensely valued. Thank you for watching.